Welcome to the post-film conversation for Far East Deep South, part of the series Projecting Connections, Chinese American Experiences. Using film as a lens to reflect on the vast lived experiences of the Chinese in the greater Boston area. This special series will feature monthly films and post-show curated discussions designed to build and foster meaningful community conversation. My name is Carrie Lynn. I'm one of the editors of Sampan newspaper, and I will be moderating today's Q&A. I am pleased to welcome our panelists for our conversation. Larissa Lam, director. Baldwin Chu, producer. Wing Kai To, historian. Wayne Ye, cultural advocate. Thank you all so much for being here with me today. For Larissa and Baldwin, I'm just curious, how did this film come to be? How did it start? I heard that it was first a short documentary.
Yeah, we did a short documentary that was 14 minutes called Finding Cleveland, and it was shown at the Boston Asian American Film Festival. In fact, they were one of the very first festivals that we showed at, and the response starting with BAF was so incredible. We didn't realize there was such an appetite for stories from the South regarding, those of Asian descent, and we ended up expanding the film to what Far East Deep South, what you all just saw right now. And part of it too is the first film was about our first trip to Mississippi, which you guys saw a little bit of, in that first day where we just uncovered so much. We thought it was enough to find Baldwin's grandfather's Bible. We thought it was just enough to take a visit and pay our respects to the grave once. And little do we know, there was just so much more history to dive into. And so that's why we decided to make a larger film, because we really felt there was more to explore.
Yeah, actually, it started off with me just wanting to show my daughter, where our family's from. When we made that first discovery about my grandfather and great grandfather being in Mississippi and not knowing from our past anything about it, we just wanted my daughter to know. And it was really supposed to be a home video. We weren't supposed to make it public or let anybody know outside of our family. But Larissa had the bright idea. By the way, we're married, in case people didn't know that. So we are married, and her job was really to watch our daughter and say, and I said to her, stay back, keep her out of our hair. Let's figure out what this whole family thing was. And Larissa was like, hey, maybe we should do more.
We should do more. I mean, really, we both grew up in California, and I'm sure everyone around the country, and even in the Boston area can relate to this. But we learn a lot about American history, but we rarely learn about the Asian experience in America, except for maybe the railroads and the Japanese internment. And we also all learn about segregation. We learn about the American South, and nowhere is it in our history books that Chinese were there, other Asians were there. And for us, that was a really important piece of American history we really felt we wanted the rest of the country and the rest of the world to really know about.
Yeah, and I think a key part of that culture is also Qingmingjie, or also known as Saomu, which is a tomb sweeping festival, and that's actually coming up early April. And I heard that served as a catalyst for this film as well.
Yeah, I mean, here's kind of a cool story. I mean, obviously the traditions of Qingming is embedded in our film because we wanted to pay respect to my grandfather and great grandfather, which we never even knew about growing up. But one of the cool stories that happened there was we showed up after the first time we went again, when we started making this film, and we're like, hey, we should get some better shots at the cemetery that my grandfather and great grandfather are buried in. And as we showed up, we had a camera crew with us, and then the people, and this was after Finding Cleveland had already been done. So the city of Cleveland, Mississippi already knew. And when we showed up, these two people were in the cemetery cleaning, right? The caretakers, one was white, one was black, and they saw us and they're like, oh, we know you guys. Are you guys here from that film? And so we were like, yeah, you saw it? We're like, of course. Hey, if you're going to be doing anything at the cemetery, hold it on right now. Let us clean off the cemetery. Let's clean off the gravesite for you. And so we weren't expecting that at all. We were just going to go there and just start shooting, but they took the time and the effort, and they weren't Chinese, they had no concept of Qingming. They just said, out of respect for you and what you're doing and what you're doing with our community, we want to make sure we clean this gravesite off for you right now before you do anything else.
Was it the specific the specific, was it the one that said Lou on it?
Yes.
Yeah, it's
Really?
Yeah, they were cleaning off the Lou gravesite. And then one of the things that we featured in our film is, you may have seen all this, the segregated cemetery of the Chinese cemetery. And, this was something that was so important, I think, to the Chinese community too, is obviously having a place to be able to bury their dead and to be able to pay their respects. And it was just so striking to me how, racism and segregation even followed people to the grave, that Chinese couldn't be buried in a white or a black cemetery. And here was such an important tradition that they ended up creating a cemetery just for the Chinese.
Yeah, here in Boston, we also have Mount Hope Cemetery. Mr. Wing Kai, as the co-author of Boston Chinatown and former board member of the Chinese Historical Society of New England, I heard that you're very knowledgeable about Mount Hope Cemetery.
Well, Mount Hope Cemetery was the main cemetery when a lot of early Chinese in Boston, they were buried over there. And there was the history of the Chinese Historical Society of New England being founded in 1992 because of the efforts of the local community to restore the Mount Hope Cemetery, and especially the Chinese section of the Mount Hope Cemetery in the late 1980s and the early 1990s. So it took about 20 years for them to actually restore the cemetery and try to preserve the record, and actually build a memorial over there. And that memorial was completed in 2007. So when I watched the film, I was really struck by all the ways in which the filmmakers try to trace the history of the ancestors and trying to find out what happened to the grandfather and the great grandfather, and why did the father have this history that he didn't know about. So I think the ways in which the filmmakers try to go to Mississippi and try to discover the historical records, going to the Cleveland City Delta State University Museum and look for all the records about his father and his grandfather. And remember, that was a very important part of historical record, is to really preserve the early Chinese settlement in Mississippi. Most people don't really know that there was a sizable Chinese community in the Deep South. And even though there were studies by historians like Professor John Zhang in California, who has written 2 books about Chinese in the Deep South, most people were not aware of that. So Larissa and Bowen made this film and actually tried to understand their family's history. They went down to Mississippi and found out all these records and even talked to the local people in the community. And that's really a wonderful way of thinking about history. It's not something just in the books, but it's something living history, and that's being preserved by generations. So they did a lot of oral history with the local people who actually found out that the grocery store was there, his grandfather's grocery store, and they didn't know anything about it. But through the interviews, they found the grocery store, and his father found the Chinese Bible that his grandfather, that his father once had. And all those history was uncovered because of that. So I think the cemetery was the final piece of the puzzle, really, at the end when they visited the cemetery and tried to really look at the early history of the grandfather and the great-grandfather.
Yeah, definitely. Wayne, I heard that you've also had some incredible experiences tracing your ancestral history. Could you tell us a little bit more about that?
Yeah, so I've always had some, interest in learning more about my family's immigration and migration experience. We're ethnically Chinese, but kind of a cultural minority in that we're Hakka Chinese, and the Hakka Chinese have the like Kejiayuan, literally meaning guest people. And so, and my family is also through Laos, ethnically Chinese, but both sides of my family settled in Laos 2 generations before me. And I'm the first generation to be born in the US. So I really wanted to understand a bit more about my family's migration history from my grandparents in China and how they ended up in Laos, to how they got caught up in the Civil War and the war in Southeast Asia, Vietnam War remnants, and got to the US. And I learned about this program called the Friends of Roots program that was primarily based in San Francisco. And they had supported Chinese Americans who have roots in Guangdong province to go back and actually visit their respective ancestral villages in China. And for me, that was a really awesome experience to be able to go and similarly to the experiences in Far East Deep South, literally having photos that I know of my family and bringing it to my ancestral village in China and seeing relatives who were a cousin of my grandfather who brought out their own photo album. And we kind of just connected the dots of who was the last person to see who. And you know, I've kind of had an interest of looking up family records in immigration system and just seeing what I can find. I haven't gotten to physically go to the archives yet, but have put in records and I've had records sent to me digitally. And so that's something I'm hoping to do a bit more of and just piece by piece kind of chip away and get some more context.
Wow, that's amazing. That process sounds so tedious almost, and I actually have never kind of even thought of tracing my own history that way. Were there any challenges? I mean, clearly it was difficult, but you know, what were some challenges that you all faced, or what might be some of the more difficult during this kind of process?
I think
Go
one
ahead.
of the things is it seems trivial, but it was very important is spelling. You know, we write our Chinese characters in our names a certain way, and that's that. But in English, you could spell it however you want to sound it, however way you want to tone it, however you want to enunciate it, and you have all these different spellings of, in my case, the last name Chu, or in Cantonese Jiu, or sometimes it's Ju, or sometimes it's Chu,
And in Mandarin, it's Zhao,
and
right?
Mandarin is
So-
Zhao, right? So what do they actually write on your documents when you're you know, coming into this country, or when you leave a certain state and go to another state and you register there? And so one of the things was really finding out how to search, like in our case, NARA, the archives, or even on online genealogy websites. How do we spell the names, and how many different ways
Yeah, and
do
if
it?
you know, in our film, you see there was a graphic about how we were explaining how his family
The last
ended up
name.
with the last name Liu, which really wasn't their last name, and how Baldwin's dad ended up changing it back to Chu. And we know that's very common. You know, Chinese last names come first, you know, but
Yeah, family names come first, right?
it's not the last name, it's the first name in Chinese. And so it was the order and the different spellings. And so, you know, for those of you who are looking to
Do more research.
we suggest putting alternate spellings and doing different combinations to try to find the right person, because sometimes if you put it in for what you think is one document, it may actually have been translated different times into something else.
Yeah, Wayne, I see you nodding your head a lot. Was that
Yeah.
something you also experienced?
Yeah, absolutely. As I've kind of come to understand like different romanization systems, for example, like my last name being Ye, meaning leaf in Chinese, but it's spelled Y-E-H, and that's kind of taken by how my grandparents, when they immigrated to the US, you know, they left China before there was the modernized, standardized romanization system in Pinyin, and kind of spell it the more diaspora, the way that it's spelled in the diaspora, and even in Taiwan. So I get mistaken for Taiwanese sometimes, even not being Taiwanese or having any roots or connections there. But also what I found that's interesting is, like, you know, Ye would be the Y-E would be the Mandarin spelling, and then Yip, like Y-I-P, would be the Cantonese spelling. But then being Hakka Chinese, Yap, like Y-A-P, is usually what the spelling is. So I've had to, when I'm doing family research, having to do all these different variations. But one thing that I found interesting is my grandfather on my paternal side, he was fully ethnic Chinese, migrated to Laos where he had 8 kids with my grandmother. And when he migrated to the US, he adopted a Laotian name, even though he isn't ethnically Lao. And his name was Soy Sayasi, Sayasi being the surname that he adopted. But when he eventually supported and sponsored other family friends to come to the US, somehow in the paperwork, they didn't get adopted they didn't immigrate with their own respective names, but they took on my grandfather's full name as their surname. So their family surnames became Soy Sayasi, which was my grandfather's first and last name. And so I always think that that's so interesting how one person, which wasn't his birth name, but a name that he adopted, eventually became part of a whole other branch of extended family, relatives, family, friends, names that got adopted and is now still their names on paper.
Yeah, that's a lot to put on a family tree.
Yeah. Put all the names on the tree.
I also think other than doing genealogy research, there's so much you can try to learn about your family's history. This is what this film does. It's not just, if you just look at the historical record and trying to trace your genealogy and your ancestors, is one kind of research. The way in which they went to Mississippi and talked to the archivists, and also talked to the people that, remembering the old days when they met the, Bowen's grandfather. And that was key because, if you did not have the oral history, you did not understand really what happened, in the 40s, in the 1940s, when his grandfather passed away. And, just trying to find out the relationship between the grandfather and the father and the emotions between both of them is really wonderful part of the film. I really like that part when his father found out that the grandfather, the whole history of the grandfather, and when they discovered that grocery store, when they discover all the friends they had in Mississippi. So that's more than just doing the genealogy and trying to understand the names, but trying to put some context into the whole history of the family.
Yeah, that's actually a great point because I think that's what actually personalized the story for us. If I made this research and I just showed my dad, hey, guess what I found? He would have been like, whatever, you can find that anywhere. But because we actually went there and we started meeting with people, I think that's what actually personalized the story and it made the story real. It wasn't just something that, some genealogy company could have told us or some document was scanned in that we found. That's just a piece of paper. But when we actually met the people, which was very difficult to do, but when we actually met them, it personalized the story and it made everything real for my father and our family.
And I would definitely say time was a challenge because, as you can see, we had several very older, citizens who had the longer memories, right? And so, sadly, if you look at it in a memoriam, it started to get a little bit longer and longer, but we were grateful we could capture a lot of these stories. And sadly, there were people that had passed that we were trying to capture their story, but they actually passed away before we were able to actually get them on camera. And so, if you're like, thinking like, I'll do it later, I'm gonna go do my family research and family history later. Don't wait. Try to do as much as you can now, because again, time is ticking and you never know, how long somebody's going to be around who's going to be able to remember the most about your family.
Yeah, and like Wing said, I mean, that's the part of the history that really takes you above and beyond the just the genealogy research. It's those personal connections and that oral history.
Yeah, and I think as having film as a medium as well, and just with technology, I think being able to record people's faces and movement, like there's so much more to just kind of preserving a person's presence. And I guess I'm wondering if that kind of might change. Do you think that might change how we study history, Wing Kai?
Yeah, I think the use of images and films for the study of history is very important. I think the personal histories that this film captures is going to be studied or used in the future alongside with the historical records. I think the people that they interviewed and talked about their own experiences really tell us a lot about life in the Deep South and in Cleveland, Mississippi, and in Pace, Mississippi. So I don't think you can find any books that talk about those grocery stores and those one Chinese store that was left and what it looked like over there. And also like the way they use the archival photos along with the real footage of the area, because of using both historical archival photos and also the documenting their whole trips, their 2 trips over there in Mississippi. then you can really see that there's a community in Cleveland that the Chinese community was living with, and they got along with the white community, the Black community, the African American community, and there was a sense of, really um, a sense of change, even though there was a period of segregation. So the Asian community and the African American community had each other to rely on. And I think that's a really important lesson for us to think about today as we think about some racial solidarity and coalition that we need to build so that people of Asian descent can actually work with people from the other side. And there's a lot of between the community over there.
Yeah, I was just wanting to kind of bring it back to what is happening in the world today, and how much this film kind of really fits in that conversation. I just wanted to ask you guys your thoughts on that.
We have many thoughts. I don't think we have time for all of them, but we'll give you a few. We could never have imagined when we made this film, and we worked on this film for 5 years. And, we first debuted it, had a world premiere at a film festival last March. Guess what happened in March? We had the pandemic, and, we've only been able to do virtual film festivals since. And, we didn't know that Chinese people, or people being mistaken as being Chinese, would be such a big thing, that would all this anti-Asian sentiment arise. We didn't know that there would be another reckoning of police brutality and systemic racism coming to the forefront with the Black community, even though it's been there for years. It's just like with the anti-Asian sentiment. It's not like it came out of nowhere. It's been there for years, and the pandemic has just brought a lot of these things to the light and the surface. And I really did frame the film knowing that these things were always bubbling in the background. And I just had no idea that they would be so relevant today, that everybody would recognize that these were issues. And our hope was always, in a sense, to hopefully learn lessons from the past. It obviously wasn't a rosy time. Segregation, Chinese Exclusion Act is not exactly fun times to be in, but there were some lessons that we can learn, just like Wing Kai was talking about, with solidarity, with community, and that we hope that if, like, those of us of Asian descent a lot of times don't feel connected to the Black history, the Black experience in America, and our film clearly shows there was a time where our stories did intersect, and there is some shared history, and vice versa. I think a lot of times the African American community doesn't feel a connection to the Chinese narrative and the immigrant experience and the Asian experience, and so we hope that theme brings a little bit more connection, and to just show that families like Baldwin's have been in this country for a long time. That's a big thing, that people are beating us up and hurling racial epithets at us because they feel like we don't belong, but we clearly do.
Yeah, and I think, coming back to what's going on today, the sentiment, the roots of what's going on today is really, people don't believe that a face like ours, all of you and all of ours, is not American. That there has not been contributions, and if there were, they weren't significant. They have not had, we have not been suffered discrimination, and we haven't been here that long, and we're just foreigners, so we don't belong. So what we believe is, this anti-Asian, whatever it is really just anti-Asian. It's not anti-Asian American, it's anti-American, because we've been American for so long, with Asian American history going back to the 1500s. We really wanted this film to show how American we really are, that our contributions were here, and that even though for all those years and decades that my family was told, keep our heads down, be silent, don't talk about the past, it'll eventually get better, it didn't get better, 100%. And so we need to let people know that, we've been around for a long time, we've contributed, we've suffered together, we've done well together, we've risen above together, and we can continue to do that in the future, but we need to be looked at as Americans first.
Even though we are not abandoning our Chinese heritage, just like somebody who's Irish American or Italian American isn't expected to be less, like to abandon that identity. Like they are still fully embraced as American today. And so those are the same things that we hope people will start to reframe what their mind and their implicit bias, says, to say an Asian face isn't foreign by default, that we can be American.
Yeah, we don't have to choose one side or the other. We can be both American and ethnically Chinese Chinese and be proud of both, and just like everyone else in America can be.
Or have roots that go to Laos and
Laos.
have a very, and we're
Right?
not a monolith.
We're not a monolith. We have great stories. Everyone has great stories, and all those stories comprise of what America is.
Yeah, thank you. I almost want to say, so Wayne, when are we going to see your documentary?
That would make an amazing story too.
Definitely.
Actually, Baldwin, you did mention that you are fourth generation American because your great grandfather was born in the U.S.
It'd be fifth.
Yeah, fifth. Yeah,
Fifth
because
generation.
fifth, his father too. So at the end of the film, you went back to San Francisco Chinatown and tried to find out the place where your great grandfather was born, and in 1870s. And so Chinese Americans have been here for 200 years and plus, and so there's a lot of history. What's interesting is the transnational nature of our immigration. You know, in the 19th century and the 20th centuries, Chinese Americans went back and forth because at that time it was common for a bachelor society for the father, for the grandfather to go. So he went back to China to get married, and so it's a history of family separation. Sometimes husbands and wives were separated for many years, and there was a lot of pain for, Bowen's father because he was only 1 year old when his grandfather passed away. So those kinds of family separation and stories is told in this film very well. And I think there's a lot of hardship and there's a lot of pain in the history of Chinese American immigration. But there's also a lot of joy, when several generations come together and try to recapture the history and try to feel, find out the roots on the one hand and try to understand our American stories together.
Yeah, and I was also struck with how similar it is to today as well. Just so many families separated because of, I don't know, work or whatnot, especially in this increasingly globalized world. I myself am a long way from home, so that's also something that I really related to. Yeah, I think that's all the time that we have for today. Thank you so much, you guys, so much to our panelists for an engaging and important conversation. Far East Deep South, along with a recording of this conversation, will be available through Sunday evening at artsemerson.org. Visit artsemerson.org for other Projecting Connections presentations featured monthly through June. Thank you for joining us.